Okay, this is a little bit of a doozy, and you will not see this story elsewhere. But before we had to start covering fistfights and sucker punches and kick the protesters' scrums at Donald Trump political events, back before Donald Trump made national presidential politics look like this in our country, it used to be a rare thing to see a punch thrown in major party national politics. It used to be really rare. It used to be newsworthy when there was even a small punch, maybe more of a shove even, within the context of presidential campaigning. But that is what happened last year when Marco Rubio's deputy campaign manager got into a little physical skirmish at a Republican conference in Michigan. This happened in September. A bunch of the Republican candidates and their campaign staffs were all hanging out on Mackinac Island in my favorite state of Michigan. And something went wrong in a bar. And you can see here in this tape that we've looped here that one of these staffers landed a punch or a shove or some kind of whap on or near the jawline of another guy who was attending that conference. So, you know, it's exciting. Bar fight or bar punch or bar shove, or not that much of anything, but this happened. And the reason anybody knew it happened is because punching and shoving used to be rare in presidential politicking, and because the two guys who were involved in this little altercation were both working for presidential campaigns. The puncher was the deputy campaign manager for Marco Rubio. The punchee, the guy on the receiving end of that, whatever it was, he identified himself publicly after the incident as both the guy who got punched in that bar and as a high-level staffer for the Rand Paul campaign, which used to be a thing. The punchee's name is a very memorable name. His name is John Yob. John Yob is a longtime Republican operative. He was national political director for John McCain in 2008. He worked on my friend Rick Snyder's gubernatorial campaign in Michigan. He worked for I Am Not a Witch, Christine O'Donnell, and her failed Senate campaign in 2010. He also worked for the Sharon Engel failed Senate campaign that same year. But John Yob, if you want to know what he really is now, he's really tried to carve out a niche for himself, not just as a generic campaign guy, but as a delegate guy. When Rick Santorum came in second in the Republican presidential primary in 2012, John Yob ran Rick Santorum's delegate operations, and that's really become his area of focus. John Yob is an experienced political operative. Here he is. Also, specifically, he's a delegate guy. He has fashioned himself into being an expert on delegates and specifically on political conventions. Last month, he published this book, Chaos, The Outsider's Guide to a Contested Republican National Convention. Timely, right? The book makes a prediction about the current Republican primary. It says, quote, "The only thing that is certain is that there will be chaos in Cleveland." Chaos in Cleveland. And, you know, even if none of the rest of us are experts on this stuff, we can all do enough of the delegate math ourselves to know that the only hope the Republican Party has of stopping Donald Trump from becoming the nominee is to try to maneuver these delegates that he's earning across the country as he wins state after state to somehow peel those delegates off Donald Trump and cobble together a majority of those delegates to support somebody else at the convention. Now, that's not stealing. It's not illegal. It's not necessarily against the rules unless they decide to break the rules. But that sort of thing, that sort of process, which I think is the only way Donald Trump doesn't end up the nominee, it's kind of a dark art, right? It requires a sorcerer's knowledge of the rules and the rules for making the rules. It requires tons of preparation and organizing. It requires a real commitment to scheme effectively and efficiently out of the public eye and behind the scenes. And that is why we were very intrigued to see this former Rand Paul staffer, the whapped in the face on Mackinac Island, chaos at the convention, delegate math, master operative from Michigan. We were very intrigued to see his name turn up at the top of this unexpected list. Because it turns out that guy, John Yob, the guy from Michigan, he just got himself a gig as a presidential delegate from the U.S. Virgin Islands. What? Republicans in the Virgin Islands held their caucus last week. And I remember reporting on it at the time. It seemed a little weird. We were like, the Virgin Islands had their caucus. So far, the result is that uncommitted won. How did that turn out? We knew there was something wrong. Well, it turns out what happened there is that John Yob was the Virgin Islands' top vote getter as a delegate. And that's kind of weird. I mean, this whole thing is weird. I mean, most particularly just because just a week before the caucus, election officials in the Virgin Islands had declared John Yob and his wife to be ineligible to even vote in the Virgin Islands. Election officials in the Virgin Islands said he had not lived there long enough to qualify to vote there. They accused him of sneaking around and lying and telling two different stories to try to basically fraudulently get himself onto the voting rolls there, even though they thought he had not lived there long enough to qualify. Then at the last minute, literally the day of the caucus, a local judge said that John Yob would be allowed to vote, pending a court hearing later this month. The effect of that ruling was that he could also, in addition to voting, he could also stand for election as a delegate later that day, the same day of the ruling. And he did stand for election as a presidential delegate, and he won. He got the most votes of anybody. And so now he's going to head to Cleveland as the head of a slate of undeclared delegates from the Virgin Islands, who can now be wooed and courted and fought over by all the candidates at the convention in Cleveland. Not to mention things like going to the Rules Committee meetings and all the other stuff that needs to happen in order to organize this plot if somebody other than Donald Trump is going to get the nomination. Now, I should tell you, John Yob says he is very much qualified for that delegate job. He says he finalized a deal on a house in the Virgin Islands back in August. He says he spent time there on and off since 2009. He says his kids are now going to school there. But if you want a little taste of what we've got in store as a nation, as operatives and guys with resumes like this insinuate themselves into the delegate process for that blessed convention, just look at this. Just look at this. Because dark political arts operative John Yob getting himself from Michigan to the Virgin Islands and then taking over that slate of undeclared delegates from those islands, it has opened a friendly little window into the most unexpectedly vicious intra-party warfare we have seen in quite some time. And here's what I mean. The vice chair of the Virgin Island Republicans, we called him for comment on this. He told us this week that he voted for John Yob. He says John Yob's experience and expertise is needed at the national convention. That's the vice chair. The chairman, on the other hand, when we contacted him for a quote, he volunteered to us that his vice chairman is, and I quote, a convicted felon, a moron, a compulsive liar, and, quote, a Nazi sympathizer. Excuse me? It's not like we asked him, so what do you think of your vice chair? He just volunteered this to us. Oh, really? Tell me more. The chairman of the Republican Party in the Virgin Islands then told us this, quote, I want nothing to do with that Nazi. And to be clear, by that Nazi, he means the vice chairman of the Republican Party in the Virgin Islands. And he's the chairman. Virgin Island Republicans, I'm kind of in love with you. All of you, I really am, because it turns out there's more. Because right at that point, once you've heard this, you got to call back the accused Nazi/moron/convict, right? Time for another quote. So we called him back, and the vice chairman told us, okay, it is true that he's a felon on account of federal fraud involving long-distance phone service in the 90s. The vice chairman told us, quote, the chairman's right. I am a convict. But the Nazi part, he says that is, quote, rubbish. Rubbish. Total hateful rubbish. Let me mention once again that this is the chairman and the vice chairman of the Republican Party in that small place. In the place where the guy who literally wrote the book on how to use the delegate process and chaos to game the Republican National Convention this year to your own advantage, he just moved to their little islands in the deep Caribbean and took over their slate of delegates to Cleveland as an uncommitted delegate. We know what chaos at political conventions looks like. It's not like we've never seen it before in our country. But this year, we are 4 months out from Cleveland. And frontrunner Donald Trump today promised riots at the Cleveland convention if he doesn't get the nomination. And the remaining candidates have all hired slates of these sorcerers who are supposed to be skilled at delegate deceit and trickery and hiding as double agents. And at least one of those kinds of operatives has just taken over one territory's slate of delegates as that party itself melts down back at home amid allegations about who's a Nazi and who's a felon and whether it's okay to be one but not both and still be running that party. I mean, we have seen chaos at conventions before. This year's chaos is well planned, it turns out, in advance.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.